These two children were brought to a photographer's studio in 1878. One of them may already have been dead. This Victorian studio portrait sat in a Leeds photographic archive for over 30 years. Catalogued simply as Two Children Studio Portrait, circa 1875 to 1880. Unremarkable, unidentified, one small card among thousands. Until 2019, when a researcher scanning the collection at high resolution enhanced the shadow at the bottom of the frame and found something that changed everything. A metal apparatus beneath the younger child's feet. Something the photographer had tried to keep hidden. By minute 4, you'll see exactly what that metal stand looks like when the shadows are stripped away, and you'll understand why its design matters. By minute 12, you'll read the words of a Victorian mother describing, in her own handwriting, why she brought her children to this studio on a cold November afternoon. And by minute 20, you'll learn whether the child standing in this portrait was alive when the shutter opened, or whether this photograph preserves something far more haunting than a childhood memory. What you're about to discover is the story of a single photograph that sits on the thinnest of lines, the line between a portrait and a memorial, between a living child and the memory of one, between what a camera captures and what it conceals. For 140 years, this image held its secret in plain sight. Nobody looked closely enough. Nobody asked the right questions. Nobody enhanced the shadow at the bottom of the frame. Until now, let me show you exactly what was hiding beneath the surface, starting with the day this photograph was made. Let's look at this photograph carefully, not quickly, not casually, the way a researcher would examine it under a magnifying glass in a climate-controlled reading room with white cotton gloves and a pencil for notes. It's a carte de visite, a small, card-mounted photograph roughly 2.5 inches by 4 inches. The format was ubiquitous in the 1870s and 1880s. Families collected them, traded them, kept them in albums with brass clasps and leather covers. This particular print is an albumin image, which gives it that characteristic warm, golden-brown tone, the kind of sepia warmth that modern filters try to imitate but never quite capture. The real thing has depth, layers. A quality of light that feels preserved rather than reproduced. The studio backdrop is a painted woodland scene. Trees, a suggestion of sky. It's slightly wrinkled at the left edge where it meets the carpeted floor, a minor imperfection the photographer either didn't notice or didn't have time to correct. Two children are positioned before it. The older child is a girl approximately 6 or 7 years old, seated in an ornate wooden chair with carved armrests. She wears a dark wool dress, likely navy or deep brown, with a white lace collar and matching cuffs at the wrists. Her hair is parted sharply down the center and drawn back behind her ears. Her hands rest in her lap, one placed carefully on top of the other. Her expression is composed, serious, controlled in the way that Victorian children were coached to be during exposures that could last 5, 10, sometimes 15 seconds. The younger child is a boy, perhaps 3 or 4 years old. He stands to her right wearing a dark velvet suit with knee-length trousers, white cotton stockings, and small buttoned boots. His jacket has a broad white Van Dyke collar folded over the lapels, a style popular for young boys in the late 1870s. His right hand appears to rest on the arm of the chair. But look closer. His posture is unnaturally rigid. His shoulders are squared with a precision that seems mechanical rather than natural. His head is perfectly centered above his spine. And his eyes, open, fixed directly on the camera lens, carry a quality of stillness that goes beyond the practiced patience of a child told not to move. Something about this boy is wrong, and it takes a moment to understand what. Now look at the bottom of the frame. The girl's dress falls to the floor in dark folds, blending with the shadow beneath the chair. Everything in the lower third of the image is dim, underexposed, the kind of shadow that Victorian photographers accepted as unavoidable given the limitations of their equipment and their lighting. But at the boy's feet, right where his small boots meet the studio carpet, there is something else. At first glance, it could be a wrinkle in the carpet, a crease caused by the weight of the furniture. It could be a stray shadow cast by the backdrop frame, a trick of the studio's uneven illumination. But there is a curved edge there, regular, manufactured, deliberate. It catches the light differently from the surrounding floor. Where the carpet is soft and textured, this edge is smooth. Hard, it has the dull, flat gleam of cast iron. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a metal object beneath this child's feet. It is not furniture. It is not a toy. It is not a decorative element of the studio. It is a piece of photographic equipment, industrial in its construction and deliberate in its placement, and it was never supposed to appear in the finished image. The photographer positioned it carefully. He angled the camera to minimize its visibility. He relied on shadow and clothing to conceal it. But it's there, and it changes everything about what this photograph might be. When the Thorsby Society's 2019 digitization team enhanced this portion of the image, adjusting contrast levels, recovering shadow detail, running edge detection algorithms across the lower third of the frame, what emerged was unmistakable. A circular cast-iron base plate, roughly 10 inches in diameter, sits flush against the studio floor beneath the boy's right foot. It has a raised rim, slightly beveled, and a central socket from which a vertical metal rod rises. The rod is visible for barely 2 inches before it disappears behind the child's trouser leg, continuing upward beneath his clothing to a point that cannot be seen in the image. This is a Brady-Style posing stand. The name comes from Matthew Brady, the American Civil War photographer whose studio popularized the device in the 1860s. The base plate anchored the stand firmly to the floor. The rod extended upward to a height adjustable by a threaded collar. At the top, a curved metal clamp, sometimes padded with cloth or leather, gripped the subject at the waist, the small of the back, or in some configurations, the base of the neck. In ordinary studio work, posing stands served a practical, unremarkable function. They prevented blur during long exposures. They held fidgeting adults steady. They kept restless children in position while the photographer counted off the seconds. Every portrait photographer in England owned at least one. They appear in supplier catalogs, studio manuals, and equipment inventories throughout the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. But the posing stand had another application, one that studios never advertised in their window displays or printed on their trade cards. In cases of post-mortem photography, where a recently deceased person was photographed as a final memorial, the posing stand held the body upright. It simulated the posture of life. It allowed the dead to appear as though they were simply standing very, very still. There's one more detail embedded in this object, and it's not on the front, it's on the back. Turning the card over reveals the photographer's printed studio mark, centered and professionally typeset. E.J. Hargrove, artistic photographer, 14 Boar Lane, Leeds. Below that, in faint pencil, the kind of quick notation a studio assistant might make while the client was still in the room, 3 lines of handwriting. Nov 23. Whitmore 2ch. Paid, return moan. November 23rd. 2 children, paid in advance, return Monday for the finished prints. It's a routine notation, standard practice. The kind of shorthand that appears on hundreds of cartes de visite from this era, unremarkable and efficient. But beneath these 3 lines in slightly different handwriting, perhaps written with a different pencil, perhaps added later, perhaps by a different hand entirely, is a single word. It is underlined twice. Keepsake. Not portrait, not family sitting, not commission. Not any of the standard terms a Victorian studio would use to categorize its work. Keepsake. In modern English, the word has softened. It suggests sentiment, nostalgia, a pleasant memory preserved. But in Victorian usage, the word carried a specific and heavier emotional gravity. A keepsake was something you held onto after someone was gone. It was a memento of absence, a token of loss. You kept a lock of hair as a keepsake. You kept a mourning ring as a keepsake. You kept the last letter someone wrote you as a keepsake. It was a word of remembrance, of grief, of the determination to hold on to something, anything, after the person it represented had disappeared from the world. And it raises the question that will drive every minute of what follows. When this photograph was made on November 23, 1878, was the boy standing beside his sister still alive? Edwin James Hargrove operated his photographic studio at 14 Boar Lane, Leeds, from 1871 until his retirement in 1894. He was not famous. He was not an innovator. He was one of dozens of commercial photographers active in the city during the late Victorian period, and his business catered to the same clientele as most of them, the middle classes, clerks, shopkeepers, tradesmen. Families who could afford the modest fee of 1 to 2 shillings for a set of carte de visite prints, but who would never commission a full oil portrait or sit for a fashionable London studio. Hargrove's surviving business records, including appointment ledgers, financial accounts, and studio equipment inventories, were donated to the West Yorkshire Archive Service by his grandson in 1953. They are preserved in acid-free boxes in a climate-controlled repository in Wakefield, catalogued under a reference number that means nothing to anyone who doesn't spend their working life in archives. I requested the appointment ledger covering the second half of 1878. 3 weeks later, I sat in a reading room in Wakefield wearing white cotton gloves, the kind that leave no oils on paper that has survived for nearly a century and a half. The room smelled of old paper and the faint chemical tang of preservation treatments. The light was even and fluorescent, designed to illuminate without damaging. I opened the ledger. The pages were brittle at the edges, the ink faded from its original black to a rust brown that varied in intensity with the pressure of Hargrove's pen. Each page was divided into rows by faint pencil lines, each row a single entry, each entry a family that had walked through the studio door, sat before the camera, and left behind an image of themselves. The entries were organized chronologically and read with the practiced efficiency of a businessman. Oct. 14, Harrison, husband and wife, 3 carts, 2s, 6D. Oct. 19, Broadbent, infant on mother's knee, 2 carts, 1, 6D. Transaction after transaction, family after family. I turned to November. Near the bottom of the second November page, I found it. And I need you to pay attention to every word of this entry because the details matter. The entry for November 23, 1878 reads as follows. Nov 23 Whitmore A 2 children full standing and seated. Brady stand wrecked for younger, short sitting child unwell. 4 carts ordered, paid 3s, note to be ready by Moan, 25th, priority. Now compare that to the entries immediately above and below it on the page. Thompson, family group, 6 carts, 3s. Barker, gentleman, half-length, 2 carts, 1s, 6D. Simple, transactional, name, service, fee, no commentary, no qualifications, no special instructions. But the Whitmore entry contains 3 details that appear nowhere else on this page, and rarely anywhere in the entire surviving ledger. First, Brady stand wrecked for younger. Hargrove specifically noted that the posing stand was required for the younger child. This was not his standard practice. In most sittings, the posing stand was used as a matter of course, a routine piece of equipment so commonplace it warranted no mention, like noting that a pen was used to write a letter. The fact that Hargrove recorded it, that he took the time to write those 5 additional words, suggests that the stand's use in this sitting was not routine. It was noteworthy, it was essential. Second, short sitting, child unwell. The child was sick, Hargrove knew it, he could see it. The session was abbreviated, not the usual careful process of arranging poses, adjusting the backdrop, testing the light, making multiple exposures from different angles. This was a single, hurried shot, 1 exposure, 1 chance. Third, priority. The prints were to be ready by Monday, November 25th, 2 days after the sitting. The standard turnaround for a set of carte de visite prints in Hargrove's studio was 7 to 10 days. Priority orders appear infrequently in the ledger and were typically associated with specific occasions, a wedding anniversary, a family departure, a time-sensitive gift. Someone in the Whitmore family was willing to pay for speed. Someone needed those prints urgently. The question that hangs over all 3 notations is the same. Why the rush? Why the abbreviated session? Why the special note about the posing stand? And why was this child too unwell to stand on his own? I went back through the entire 1878 ledger, not just November, every page, every entry, January through December. I was looking for a pattern for any other entries where Hargrove noted the posing stand with a specific comment about the subject's physical condition, where the combination of Brady stand, a health notation, and the word priority appeared together. I found 4 entries across the full calendar year. March 9, 1878. Cartwright infant Brady stand, mother supporting, child v. pale, priority. June 21, 1878. Openshaw boy age 2 Brady stand at full support, short sitting, priority. September 3, 1878. Laycock girl 5ers Brady stand, standing portrait wrecked by family, delicate, priority. November 23, 1878. The Whitmore entry. 4 sittings across 8 months, all children, all requiring the posing stand with special documentation, all marked priority, all with language suggesting the child's condition was visibly compromised, pale, delicate, unwell, requiring full support. I cross-referenced these 4 surnames with the burial registers for parishes across the Leeds district during the corresponding time periods. The process took several days and required correspondence with 3 separate archives. But the results, when they came back, formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The Cartwright infant, buried at St. Matthew's, Holbeck, March 16, 1878, 7 days after the studio sitting. The Openshaw boy, buried at Beckett Street Cemetery, June 29, 1878, 8 days after his sitting. The Laycock girl, buried at St. Michael's, Headingley, September 11, 1878, 8 days after hers. 3 studio sittings, 3 child burials within a single week of the photograph being taken. 3 families who walked into Edwin Hargrove's studio with a child who was either dying or, in some cases, possibly already dead, and asked him to make a portrait, to create an image, to preserve what was about to disappear. A pattern was forming, and it pointed toward a practice that Edwin Hargrove never advertised, never listed on his trade card, never mentioned in the studio's printed materials, but clearly, quietly, and compassionately performed. The photography of children at the very edge of life. But why? Why were so many children in Leeds dying in 1878 that a single photographer, operating from a modest studio on Boar Lane, recorded 4 emergency sittings in 8 months? What was killing them? The answer was already documented. It had been sitting in the public health records of the city for 140 years, written in the careful, clinical prose of a man whose job was to count the dead and report to the authorities. And it was far worse than I had expected. In the autumn of 1878, the city of Leeds was in the grip of a scarlet fever epidemic. The disease had been present in the northern parishes since the summer months, simmering in the overcrowded streets and poorly drained terraces. But by October, it had exploded. It spread into Headingley, Burley, Woodhouse, and Kirkstall, the exact parishes where Hargrove's clients lived, the exact neighborhoods where the Cartwright and Openshaw and Laycock and Whitmore families kept house. Children between the ages of 2 and 8 were the most vulnerable, and the medical officer of health for Leeds, a physician named Dr. James Goldie, was documenting every case that crossed his desk. What his reports revealed was a city under siege. So here is what we know. A professional studio photographer in Leeds recorded a sitting for 2 children in late November 1878. His appointment ledger contains notations that appear nowhere else on the page, a specific request for the posing stand, a note that the child was unwell, and the single word, priority. 3 of the 4 other sittings in his ledger bearing identical notations correspond to children who were buried within days of being photographed. The pattern is unmistakable. It points toward a practice that was common but unspoken, compassionate but deeply unsettling. But the question that matters most is not what Edwin Hargrove placed beneath the child's feet. The question is, why couldn't the child stand on his own? Dr. James Goldie's quarterly report to the Leeds Corporation for October through December 1878 runs to 42 pages. It is preserved in the local studies collection at Leeds Central Library, bound in faded board covers with a printed title page that reads, Report of the Medical Officer of Health for the Borough of Leeds, 4th quarter, 1878. It is the kind of document that sits on a shelf for decades without being opened, read only by scholars with very specific interests and very particular patients. But even Goldie's measured, clinical prose, the carefully restrained language of a man trained to document catastrophe without flinching, cannot contain the scale of what was happening in his city. The prevalence of scarlatina in the northern and northwestern districts of the borough, he wrote in his November summary, has reached a level which I am compelled to describe as epidemic. The mortality among children under the age of 8 years has been especially severe. 347 confirmed cases of scarlet fever in the Leeds district between October 1 and December 31, 1878. 89 resulting in death. 89 children in a single quarter in a single city. The disease moved through neighborhoods the way weather moves through a valley. A child in one household fell ill on a Monday. By Friday, 3 children on the same street were burning with fever. By the following week, the adjacent streets were affected. Quarantine was recommended by the health authorities but barely enforced. Sanitation in the northern parishes was poor. Running water was a luxury that many terraced houses had not yet received. And the medical interventions available to families and physicians were, by modern standards, essentially non-existent. Cold compresses, poultices, occasional doses of quinine, hope. There was no antibiotic. There was no vaccine. There was no treatment that could kill the bacterium ravaging these children's bodies. There was nothing to do but keep the child comfortable, keep the other children away if possible, and wait. Wait for the fever to break or wait for the child to die. The baptism register of St. Michael's Church, Headingley, records the christening of Thomas Arthur Whitmore on April 12, 1874. Son of Arthur Whitmore, described as clerk, and Mary Whitmore, his wife, of 23 Hawthorn Terrace, Headingley. The entry is written in the parish clerk's neat hand, the ink still legible after 150 years. It establishes one critical fact: Thomas's age at the time of the photograph, 4 years and 7 months. Headingley in the 1870s was a neighborhood in transition. It sat at the edge of Leeds's urban core, a district of recently built terraced houses occupied by families who aspired to respectability but had not yet achieved affluence. The houses were new but densely packed. Streets were narrow. Drainage systems were incomplete, still being installed by a corporation that could not keep pace with the speed of construction. The roads were cleaned irregularly, the gutters often running with waste that should have been carried away by pipes that did not yet exist. When scarlet fever entered the parish in the summer of 1878, it found an environment perfectly suited to its transmission. Close quarters, shared water sources, children playing together in the same streets, attending the same schools, breathing the same air. Dr. Goldie's report includes a street-by-street appendix of confirmed scarlet fever cases for the affected parishes. The appendix is organized alphabetically by street name, and against each entry is a number indicating confirmed cases reported during the quarter. Hawthorn Terrace appears 3 times. The epidemic was not merely in Thomas Whitmore's city. It was not merely in his parish. It was on his street. It was in the houses adjacent to his own. It was at his front door, and there was nothing between it and the 4-year-old boy inside except the thin walls of a terraced house and the desperate hope of his parents. Arthur Whitmore earned £72 per year as a junior correspondence clerk at Hardcastle and Briggs, wool merchants, Wellington Street. Enough for a rented terrace house and a studio portrait. Not enough to outrun an epidemic. Stay with me. By minute 12, you'll read the actual words of the mother who brought these 2 children to this photographer's studio. Her letter survived for 140 years, passed down through a chain of women who kept it safe without fully understanding its significance. And what she wrote about the day this portrait was made will change the way you see every single detail in this image. To modern sensibilities, the idea of photographing a dying child or a child who has already died seems almost unbearable. It feels macabre, transgressive, the kind of practice that belongs to horror films rather than family albums. But in the Victorian era, it was an act of love, and understanding that is essential to understanding this photograph. Childhood mortality in late 19th century England was staggering by any modern standard. In 1878, roughly 1 in 6 children born in urban areas would not survive to their 5th birthday. In the poorest districts, in the crowded courts and back-to-back houses of industrial cities like Leeds and Manchester and Birmingham, the figure approached 1 in 4. Parents in the Victorian era did not simply fear the loss of a child. They expected it. They prepared for it, not with the fatalistic resignation of people who had stopped caring, but with the grim, determined pragmatism of people who had learned that grief, if it was not managed, could destroy everything that remained. They developed rituals. They wore mourning jewelry made from jet and black enamel. They printed memorial cards with the child's name and dates and a verse of scripture. They cut locks of hair and sealed them in lockets. They wove hair into wreaths and displayed them under glass domes in the parlor. And they commissioned photographs. A studio portrait was often the only image a family would ever possess of a child. There were no cameras in pockets, no casual snapshots at birthday parties, no school pictures sent home in envelopes. If a child was healthy, the portrait was a celebration, a marker of milestones, of growth, of the family's ability to afford such a luxury. But if the child was ill, if the child was fatting, the portrait became something else entirely. It became an insurance policy against forgetting. A race against the disappearance of a face that would soon exist only in memory. And memory fades. Victorian parents knew this. They knew it with a clarity that most of us, surrounded by thousands of images of our children, can barely comprehend. The photograph did not fade. The photograph held still. Scarlet fever followed a cruel and predictable course. It began with a sore throat, unremarkable at first, indistinguishable from a common cold. Within 24 hours, a rash appeared, a fine, stippled redness that spread from the chest and neck outward to the arms and legs. The child's face flushed crimson except for a characteristic pale ring around the mouth that physicians used as a diagnostic marker. Temperature spiked. 103 degrees, 104. The child became listless, then confused, then delirious. In mild cases, and there were many mild cases, the fever broke within a week. The rash faded. The skin peeled in sheets, a disturbing but harmless final symptom, and the child recovered. But in severe cases, the infection did not relent. It burrowed deeper. It attacked the kidneys, causing them to fail. It damaged the heart, leaving permanent scarring on the valves. It caused abscesses in the ears that led to permanent deafness. And in the worst cases, the most severe presentations, it simply overwhelmed the child's capacity to fight. The body could not produce enough resistance, could not generate enough heat, could not maintain enough function to survive. A child with severe scarlet fever could move from the first sore throat to death in as little as 5 days. 5 days. And in the 3rd week of November 1878, at 23 Hawthorn Terrace in the parish of Headingley, a 4-year-old boy named Thomas Arthur Whitmore began to feel unwell. We cannot know the precise day Thomas fell ill. No physician's diary survives. No family log records the first cough, the first complaint of a sore throat, the first moment Mary pressed her hand to her son's forehead and felt the heat that meant everything was about to change. But the documents allow us to reconstruct a probable timeline with uncomfortable precision. The death certificate, which we will examine shortly, records Thomas's death on December 14, 1878. Cause of death, scarlatina. Duration of illness, about 4 weeks. 4 weeks before December 14 places the onset of Thomas's illness at approximately November 16th. Which means that on November 23rd, when Arthur and Mary Whitmore dressed their children in their best clothes and walked through the streets of Leeds to Edwin Hargrove's studio on Boar Lane, Thomas had been ill for roughly 1 week. He was feverish. He was weak. He had lost his appetite. He was, by his mother's later account, unable to stand on his own. And they brought him anyway. They dressed him in his velvet suit with the white Van Dyke collar. They pulled on his cotton stockings and buttoned his small boots. They wrapped him against the November cold. And they carried him, because he could not walk the distance himself, through streets where the epidemic was still raging, to a photographer's studio where a stranger would hold him upright with a metal stand and capture a single frame of light. The posing stand was not a convenience that day. It was a necessity. It held Thomas upright because his body could not do what bodies are supposed to do. It held him because he was dying. And the question that burns at the center of this photograph is whether his parents brought him to that studio because they believed he would recover, or because they feared he would not. The ledger had given me a name. The baptism register had given me a birth date. The medical officer's report had given me a context so bleak it was difficult to read without stopping to look away from the page. But none of these documents had given me the one thing I needed most, a human voice, a perspective from inside the family, an account, however brief, of what it was like to live through these weeks and to make the decisions that produced this photograph. I did not expect to find one. Personal correspondence from working-class and lower-middle-class Victorian families rarely survives. Letters were written on cheap paper. They were kept in drawers and boxes, not in archives. They were discarded during house moves, lost in floods and fires, thrown away by descendants who did not understand their value. The survival rate for personal letters from this period and this social class is vanishingly small. But sometimes a letter survives. Sometimes it passes from one hand to another across generations, tucked inside a book or folded into an envelope that nobody opens for decades, until it reaches someone who recognizes what it is and delivers it to a place where it will be preserved. In 2006, a retired schoolteacher in Harrogate named Margaret Fawcett donated a box of family papers to the Thorsby Society in Leeds. The papers had belonged to her grandmother, who had inherited them from her mother, a woman named Jane Colton. Jane Colton was Mary Whitmore's older sister. The two women had written to each other regularly throughout the 1870s and 1880s. Most of the surviving letters are unremarkable. Children's milestones, household expenses, complaints about weather, recipes for ginger cake and beef broth. The ordinary domestic texture of two sisters maintaining their bond across the 30 miles between Leeds and Harrogate. But one letter in the collection is not like the others. It is dated November 28, 1878, 5 days after the studio sitting, and it contains a passage that, once read, makes it impossible to look at this photograph the same way again. The letter is 2 pages long, written on lined paper in a hurried but legible hand. The iron gall ink, black when Mary dipped her pen, has faded over 140 years to a deep, uneven brown. The paper is foxed with age spots and creased from decades of folding and unfolding by hands that valued what was written on it. The edges are soft, almost furry, from the oils of fingers that held it and read it and held it again. I'm going to read this slowly because every word matters. Mary writes, "Dear Jane, I write in haste and with a heavy heart. Our Thomas has been ill these 12 days past. The doctor came again on Tuesday and says it is the scarlet fever. He is very weak and will not eat. Nell sits beside him and reads from his picture book, but he does not attend to it as he used to. Nell Eleanor, the girl in the chair. Arthur says we must have a likeness made while we can. I did not wish to hear him say it, but I know he is right. On Saturday last, we wrapped Thomas in his good suit and carried him to Mr. Hargrove's on Boar Lane. Nell walked beside and held his hand. They carried him. He could not walk. They wrapped a dying 4-year-old in his velvet suit and carried him through the streets of Leeds to a photographer's studio, and his 7-year-old sister walked alongside holding his hand. The photographer was most kind. He said it would take only a moment. He placed the stand beneath Thomas so that he could be upright beside his sister. Thomas did not cry, but he trembled so. I stood behind the camera and held my breath the whole while. Nell held perfectly still. She is such a good girl, Jane. She did not understand why we were there, but she did as she was told. He trembled. His mother held her breath. His sister held still. The pictures will be ready Monday. Arthur will fetch them. I shall send one to you directly so that you will have it. I cannot write more. Pray for us. Your loving sister, Mary. 12 sentences. That is all. 12 sentences written by a woman whose child was dying, who had just carried him to a photographer's studio, who knew what was coming and could not stop it, and could only ask her sister to pray. No ornament, no dramatic language, no plea for sympathy. Just the facts of an afternoon that would produce the most important photograph her family would ever own. Read that letter again in your mind, and one phrase rises above everything else, louder than the rest, impossible to set aside. Arthur says we must have a likeness made while we can. While we can. Not before Christmas, not for the grandparents, not while the weather is fine, while we can, while he is still alive, while his eyes can still open, while his chest still rises and falls, while he can still be dressed and carried and held upright with help beside his sister. Arthur Whitmore was not being morbid. He was not being ghoulish. He was being practical in the specific, devastating way that Victorian parents had learned to be practical about the deaths of their children. He looked at his son, at the boy who had stopped eating, who no longer attended to his picture book, who trembled but did not cry, and he made a calculation that no parent should ever have to make. This child may die. If he dies, we will have no image of him, no likeness. No proof that his face looked the way it looked, nothing but memory. And memory fades. So they dressed him, they carried him. They walked to Boar Lane in the November cold, Eleanor beside them holding her brother's small, hot hand. They entered a studio that smelled of chemicals and carpet dust and asked a stranger to do what they could not do themselves. Stop time. Hold a single moment in place. Preserve the arrangement of light that fell on their son's face on the afternoon of November 23, 1878, before the disease took everything else. They could not cure him. They could not cool his fever. They could not kill the bacteria that were destroying him from the inside. They had no weapon against the thing that was stealing their child. Except a camera, except a glass plate, except a metal stand to hold him upright and a photographer kind enough to work quickly. They could not save his life, so they saved his image. Edwin Hargrove knew. His ledger tells us that with clinical precision. Short-sitting, child unwell. He saw what was happening. He understood the urgency. He abbreviated the session to spare Thomas the ordeal of a prolonged sitting. He marked the order priority, committing to a 2-day turnaround instead of the standard 10. Mary's letter confirms what the ledger implies. The photographer was most kind. He said it would take only a moment. In an era when death was a constant visitor and grief was born with a stoicism that we would now recognize as unsustainable, the studio photographer occupied a position of quiet, difficult importance. He was the person families turned to in their worst moments. He was asked to create an image of beauty from the raw material of anguish. to make a dying child look like a living one, to get the exposure right, the composition right, the focus right in a single attempt. There would be no second sitting. There would be no, let's try that again next week. Hargrove was not a bystander to this family's grief. He was an active participant in their act of preservation, and his compassion, documented in a ledger notation and a mother's grateful sentence, is itself a form of testimony about the character of everyone involved. The General Register Office death certificate for Thomas Arthur Whitmore was registered on December 16, 1878, at the Headingley Sub-District Registry Office. It is a standard government form, printed in black ink on heavy paper, completed in the registrar's careful copperplate handwriting. Name: Thomas Arthur Whitmore. Sex: male. Age: 4 years. Date of death: December the 14th, 1878. Place of death: 23 Hawthorn Terrace, Headingley. Cause of death: scarlatina, 14 days. Certified by Dr. R. Kendall, surgeon. And at the bottom of the form, in the column marked signature, description, and residence of informant, 6 words that carry more weight than anything else on the page. Arthur Whitmore, father, present at the death, 23 Hawthorn Terrace. Present at the death. It is a standard legal formulation. The registrar wrote it without emphasis, without commentary, in the same steady hand he used for every death he recorded that week. It is bureaucratic language, administrative language, the language of a system designed to process grief into data. But it means that Arthur was in the room. He was there when Thomas stopped breathing. He watched. He stayed. He did not leave. And then within 2 days he walked to the registry office and reported the particulars of his son's death in a voice steady enough for the registrar to transcribe. Thomas Whitmore lived for 21 days after the photograph was taken. The portrait his parents commissioned on November 23rd was not a memorial created after death. It was not a post-mortem photograph in the strictest sense of the term. It was something both simpler and more devastating. It was a farewell made before it was needed, a goodbye spoken while the person was still in the room. Mary Whitmore wrapped her dying son in his finest clothes, carried him through the streets of Leeds to a photographer's studio, and asked a stranger to capture the last image her family would ever possess of him. 21 days later, Thomas was dead. He was buried in the common ground of St. Michael's churchyard without a headstone. The photograph, the one artifact that held both children together in a single frame, was all that remained. But what happened to the girl in the chair? What happened to Eleanor, the sister who held perfectly still because she was told to? And did this family ever recover from the November afternoon that produced the most important photograph they would ever own? There is no letter describing the decision to leave Hawthorn Terrace. No diary entry recording the conversation, if there was one, in which Arthur and Mary agreed they could not remain in the house where their son had died. But the documentary record tells us clearly that they left. The 1881 census, taken in April of that year, roughly 2 years and 4 months after Thomas's death, shows the Whitmore household at a new address. 7 Back Victoria Road, Burley. They had moved, not far. Burley was an adjacent parish less than 2 miles from Headingley, but they had left. They had walked away from 23 Hawthorn Terrace, from the street that appeared 3 times in Dr. Goldie's appendix of epidemic cases, from the proximity of St. Michael's churchyard, where Thomas lay in unmarked ground. Sometimes the most significant decisions a family makes are recorded not in letters or legal proceedings, but in the quiet act of listing a different address on a government form. The Whitmores did not write a memoir about their grief. They did not publish an account of their loss. They expressed it in the only way available to people of their class and their era. They packed their belongings. They moved to a different street. They tried to begin again in rooms that did not contain the memory of a child's sickbed, walls that had not absorbed the sound of labored breathing, a window that did not look out onto the route they had walked carrying Thomas to Boar Lane. They walked away from the geography that contained their grief. Hargrove made 4 prints. Arthur collected them on Monday, November 25th, 2 days after the sitting, 19 days before Thomas died. One stayed with the family. It would have occupied a place of permanence in the household, a framed image on the mantelpiece, a card pressed between the pages of a Bible, a small rectangle tucked into an album alongside whatever other photographs the Whitmores possessed. One was sent to Jane Colton in Harrogate, as Mary had promised in her letter. "I shall send one to you directly so that you will have it." The remaining 2 went to grandparents, aunts, uncles, or perhaps into a drawer where they rested for years, handled occasionally, looked at in silence, put away again. These 4 small prints, 2.5 inches by 4 inches each, were the entirety of Thomas Whitmore's visual existence. There were no candid snapshots, no birthday photographs, no images captured at play or at rest or asleep in his mother's arms, no school portraits, no moving images, no casual records of an ordinary childhood. Just this single sitting, this single exposure. This single arrangement of light and chemistry and velvet and lace, and a metal stand doing the work of legs that could no longer bear weight. Every memory of what Thomas looked like, the precise shape of his face, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the color of his eyes that the sepia print could only approximate, would eventually depend entirely on this image. When Mary Whitmore closed her eyes 10 years later and tried to summon her son's face, this photograph is what she would see. The velvet suit, the white collar, the rigid posture, the fixed gaze, the hidden stand holding him steady in the last light he would ever stand in. The photograph was not just an image, it was his only monument. The burial register of St. Michael's Church, Headingley, records Thomas's interment in a single line. Dec. 17, Thomas Arthur Whitmore, aged 4 of 23 Hawthorn Terrace, scarlet fever. He was buried 3 days after his death, in the common ground of the churchyard. Common ground was the designation used for sections allocated to families who could not afford a private plot or an individual headstone. Arthur Whitmore's annual salary of £72 was sufficient for a rented terrace house, for a set of carte visite prints, for the small dignities of a respectable lower middle-class life. It was not sufficient for a permanent memorial in stone. Individual headstones in the common ground were rare. Wooden crosses, when used, rotted within a decade. The common section at St. Michael's has long since been grassed over. Today it is a smooth expanse of lawn, maintained by the parish, bordered by mature trees. No stone bears Thomas's name. No marker identifies the precise location where Arthur Whitmore stood on December 17, 1878, and watched his son's coffin lowered into ground that had already received too many children that year. The photograph is his grave marker. The carte de visite that Edwin Hargrove produced on November 23, 1878 is the only physical object remaining in the world that says with certainty, this child existed. He had a face. He had a name. He wore a velvet suit with a white collar. He stood beside his sister in a studio on Boar Lane while his mother held her breath and a metal stand held him upright. He was here. He mattered. He was loved. If you're still watching, you already understand that this photograph was not a casual studio portrait. It was an act of desperation by 2 parents who knew they were running out of time. What you don't know yet is what happened to the girl, the sister, the one seated in the chair, the one who held her brother's hand on the walk to the studio without understanding why. Her story doesn't end in 1878, and what she did with the rest of her life will stay with you long after this video is over. To understand the full weight of what was lost, look at the 1871 census. 7 years before the photograph, 7 years before the epidemic, a different world. The entry shows the Whitmore household at 23 Hawthorn Terrace in its original form. Arthur Whitmore, age 28, clerk. Mary Whitmore, age 25, wife. Eleanor Whitmore, age 1. A young family at the beginning of everything. Arthur had been at Hardcastle and Briggs for 2 years. Mary was managing a household for the first time. Eleanor was learning to walk, learning to speak, learning to reach for objects that glittered and fascinated her. Thomas had not yet been born. He would arrive 3 years later in the spring of 1874, christened at St. Michael's on a Sunday in April when the trees in the churchyard were coming into leaf. This is the family before the epidemic, before the metal stand and the trembling child and the hurried exposure and the word keepsake written in pencil on the back of a photograph. This is who they were when the future still held 4 people in it, when Hawthorn Terrace was a hopeful address rather than a haunted one, when the worst thing that had happened to them was probably a difficult winter or an unexpected bill. They did not know what was coming. No one ever does. Thomas was dead, but the epidemic was not over. Dr. Goldie's report documented new cases of scarlet fever in the Headingley parishes through December 1878 and into January 1879. The disease had not finished with the neighborhood. It had not finished with Hawthorn Terrace. The bacterium that had killed Thomas was still circulating through the streets where his family lived, still passing from child to child through the mechanisms of proximity and shared air and inadequate sanitation. And Eleanor was 7 years old, squarely within the most vulnerable age range. Imagine what that winter was like for Arthur and Mary Whitmore. They had buried their son 3 days before Christmas. The photograph was on the mantelpiece, 4 small prints distributed among family members who would look at them and feel the specific, terrible gratitude of having received them in time. And every morning in the weeks and months that followed, Arthur and Mary would have looked at their daughter, the girl who had sat in the carved wooden chair and held perfectly still, who had walked to Boar Lane holding her brother's hand without comprehending what was happening, and they would have checked. Checked her forehead for warmth, checked her throat for redness, checked her chest for the first stippling of a rash that would mean the disease had come for their second child. Every day that Eleanor woke up without symptoms was a reprieve. Not a guarantee, not a promise, a reprieve. A single day's grace from a disease that had already taken one of their children and was still moving through the streets outside. What happened to Eleanor? The question seems simple. A name, a date, a location, how hard could it be? The answer is remarkably hard. Victorian women are among the most difficult subjects in genealogical research. Upon marriage, they changed their surnames. They moved to their husband's parish. They disappeared from the registers and directories they had occupied as children, swallowed by a new identity that bore no visible connection to their old one. Without a marriage record linking Eleanor Whitmore to her married name, she could vanish from the documentary record as completely as her brother had vanished from the census. Not into death, but into the particular anonymity that Victorian society imposed on women who followed the expected path of courtship, marriage, and domestic life. I searched the General Register Office Marriage Index for Eleanor Whitmore in the Leeds registration district. The late 1880s yielded nothing. 1890 yielded nothing. 1891 and 1892, nothing. I expanded the search to adjacent districts. Harrogate, Bradford, Wakefield, still nothing. For a moment, sitting in front of a screen filled with negative results, I wondered whether she had survived at all. Whether scarlet fever had taken her too, in some later outbreak, in some parish I hadn't checked, in some year when the disease returned as it periodically did throughout the 1880s. My breath caught. Then I found it. Third quarter of 1893. The General Register Office Marriage Index, available through the civil registration records digitized and searchable through national genealogical databases. Eleanor Whitmore to George Henry Marston. Parish, St. Michael's, Headingley. Registration District, Leeds. I read the entry twice to make sure I hadn't misread it. Then I read it a third time because the detail I had noticed was too resonant to be accidental. She married at St. Michael's, the same church, the same parish, the same churchyard. On a day in August 1893, 15 years after her brother's burial, Eleanor Whitmore stood at the altar of the church in whose grounds Thomas lay in unmarked common earth. She walked across the churchyard to reach the door. His grave was somewhere beneath the lawn she crossed, invisible, undifferentiated from the grass around it, but there, present in its absence, known to the family even if it bore no stone. She had come back, whether by choice, because St. Michael's was her parish church and the conventional venue for her wedding, or by some quieter impulse, some private act of return and remembrance, she had married in the place where Thomas was laid to rest. She had begun the next chapter of her life in the shadow of the one that had ended his. The marriage certificate confirms the identification. It lists her father as Arthur Whitmore, clerk, the right Arthur Whitmore, the right family, the right Eleanor. She had survived the 1881 census, taken in April of that year, the Whitmore household at 7 Back Victoria Road, Burley. Arthur Whitmore, age 38, clerk, Mary Whitmore, age 35, wife, Eleanor Whitmore, age 10, scholar. 3 people, not 4. I stared at the entry longer than I should have. There is nothing dramatic about it. It is a census record, one of millions, a grid of columns filled in by an enumerator who walked from door to door on a single Sunday night and asked the same questions at every house. Name, relationship to head of household, age, occupation, birthplace. There is no column for the children who are missing. There is no box to tick for deceased sibling. There is no notation that this family of 3 was once a family of 4. That a boy named Thomas had slept in this household and eaten at this table and been read to from a picture book by a sister who did not yet understand what death meant. Thomas's absence is recorded not by what the census says, but by what it does not say. A blank line, an empty space, the silence where a name should have been. But Eleanor was there. She was alive. She was 10 years old. She was listed as scholar, meaning she was attending school. She had survived the epidemic that killed her brother. She had survived the winter of 1878. She had survived the move to Burley, the reorganization of a family's life around a missing person. She had made it. Eleanor Marston, née Whitmore, lived in Leeds for the rest of her life. The subsequent census records trace her path through the decades with the steady, unspectacular rhythm of a life well lived. By the 1901 census, she and George, a joiner by trade, had established a household at 14 Wingate Road, Armley. They had 3 children. The eldest was a boy named Arthur, named for Eleanor's father. The second was a girl named Mary, named for Eleanor's mother. The third was another girl named Jane. Jane, named almost certainly for Mary Whitmore's sister in Harrogate, the aunt who had received one of Thomas's photographs. The woman whose daughter's daughter would one day donate a box of family papers to the Thorsby Society, preserving the letter that told us this entire story. Eleanor carried the names of the people who had mattered most forward into the next generation. She encoded her family's history in the identities of her children. By 1911, a 4th child had arrived. George's joinery business had grown. The family had moved to a larger house on Town Street. Eleanor is listed in the census as wife, with no occupation recorded, the standard administrative designation for married women of the period. A designation that erased the labor of managing a household, raising 4 children, and carrying the private weight of a loss that had occurred when she was 7 years old. She lived to 76. She died on February 3, 1947. Between the day of the photograph and the day of her death stretched 69 years. A span that began with her holding her brother's trembling hand in a studio on Boar Lane and ended in a Leeds that Thomas would never have recognized. A city transformed beyond anything the Whitmores could have imagined. There is no recording of Eleanor's voice, no interview conducted by a historian or a journalist, no memoir written in old age about a childhood marked by loss. We cannot know whether she spoke about Thomas in her later years, whether she told her children about the brother who died before they were born, whether she described the walk to the studio, whether she remembered the feel of his hand in hers, small and hot with fever. But there is one more document from the weeks of Thomas's illness, and it provides the contrast that makes this story complete. On December 6, 1878, 8 days before Thomas died, the Leeds Mercury published a report under the headline "Fever Rages in Northern Parishes." The sanitary authorities have issued a further warning regarding the prevalence of scarlatina in Headingley, Burley, and surrounding districts. The number of cases reported in the past fortnight exceeds 100, with several fatalities among young children. This is the public record, clinical, measured, statistical. Several fatalities among young children. Thomas Whitmore would become one of those fatalities 8 days later. His name would not appear in the newspaper. His death would not be reported as news. He would be counted among the 89, tabulated in Dr. Goldie's quarterly statistics, and forgotten by everyone except the people who loved him. But to Eleanor, the 7-year-old girl who sat beside him in the photograph, who read from his picture book while he could no longer follow the words, who held perfectly still in the photographer's studio because she was told to, Thomas was not a statistic. He was not a data point in a medical officer's report. He was the boy in the next room. He was the reason the photograph existed. And he was the absence that shaped everything that came after. The missing name on the census, the echo in the names she gave her children, the memory she carried for 69 years in a city that moved on without noticing. Eleanor Whitmore survived. She grew up in the shadow of her brother's death. She married at the same church where he was buried. She named her children after the people who had carried her family through the worst year of their lives. But the photograph, the carte de visite that Edwin Hargrove made on November 23, 1878, disappeared from the family's possession and entered the anonymous circulation of Victorian images, stripped of names, stripped of context, stripped of everything that gave it meaning. For over a century, no one knew who these children were. No one knew what the metal stand beneath the boy's feet signified. Until modern technology gave this portrait back its voice. Scarlet fever did not stop with Thomas Whitmore. It did not pause for his funeral. It did not observe the grief of his parents or the confusion of his sister. It continued through the spring of 1879 and returned in subsequent waves. Dr. Goldie's reports for 1880, 1882, and 1884 documented fresh outbreaks, each one claiming more children, each one sending more families through the doors of photographers' studios with sons and daughters who trembled and could not stand. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn. Sanitation reforms in the 1880s brought improved drainage and cleaner water to the northern parishes. Public health legislation mandated the compulsory notification of infectious disease cases. Quarantine protocols were tightened and for the first time meaningfully enforced. By the 1890s, the mortality rate from scarlet fever in the Leeds district had fallen by half. The disease that killed Thomas Whitmore was not defeated by medicine. Not yet. It was beaten back by pipes and drains and regulations, by the slow, unglamorous, essential machinery of public health infrastructure. Progress was coming. It came too late for Thomas. Scarlet fever is caused by group A streptococcus bacteria. Today it is treated with a standard course of oral penicillin. 10 days of antibiotics. Recovery is nearly universal. Side effects are minimal. The prescription can be written in a routine appointment and filled at any chemist for less than £2. Penicillin was discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928. It entered widespread clinical use in the early 1940s. By the time Eleanor Marston died in February 1947, it was available in hospitals and pharmacies across Britain. Thomas Whitmore died of a disease that would eventually require nothing more than a 10-day course of pills and a glass of water. The metal stand that held him upright in a photographer's studio on November 23, 1878, the hidden apparatus that launched this entire investigation, existed because medical science had not yet discovered a compound that a modern child swallows without complaint at breakfast. The injustice of it is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. There is no villain to blame, no conspiracy to expose, no system to condemn. It is the quiet, grinding injustice of timing, of being born into a decade that lacked the knowledge to save you, of dying 50 years too early for the cure that would have made your death unthinkable. Thomas Whitmore did not need a metal stand. He needed penicillin, and penicillin did not yet exist. Look at the photograph now. Look at it knowing everything you know. The boy in the velvet suit is Thomas Arthur Whitmore. He is 4 years and 7 months old. He has been ill with scarlet fever for approximately 1 week. He cannot stand on his own. A cast-iron posing stand, hidden beneath his clothing, holds him upright because his legs cannot bear his weight. He trembles but does not cry. His eyes are open. He is alive. Barely, but alive. The girl in the carved wooden chair is Eleanor Whitmore. She is 7. She walked to this studio holding her brother's hand. She does not understand why she is here, why her parents dressed Thomas in his best suit and carried him through the cold streets, why her mother is standing behind the camera with her breath held tight in her chest. She holds perfectly still because she was told to. She is such a good girl. Behind the camera, out of frame, their mother stands motionless. She will write to her sister 5 days from now. She will describe this moment in 12 sentences that will survive for 140 years. 21 days from now, Thomas will be dead. Eleanor will live to 76. The photograph will outlast both of them. It will outlast everyone who knew them. It will outlast the studio, the street, and the epidemic that brought them here. In 1878, to preserve the image of a dying child required a trip to a professional studio, a metal stand bolted to the floor, a chemical process that took days to complete, and a fee of 3 shillings that represented a meaningful expenditure for a clerk's family. Today we carry cameras in our pockets. We photograph our children 1,000 times before they learn to walk. We accumulate so many images that we forget most of them, scrolling past faces without pausing, deleting duplicates without thought, storing thousands of moments in devices we will eventually lose or replace. Arthur and Mary Whitmore had one chance, one sitting, one exposure. One afternoon on Boar Lane when the light was fading and their son was trembling and the photographer worked as quickly as his equipment allowed. They did not waste it. In 2022, the University of Bradford's Digital Imaging and Photographic Technology Lab agreed to examine the Whitmore carte de visite using analytical techniques unavailable to any previous generation of researchers. The photograph was scanned at 4800 dpi, a resolution that captures detail invisible to the naked eye. The digital file was then subjected to a suite of processes: contrast enhancement, shadow recovery, edge detection, and AI-assisted pattern recognition trained on a database of over 12,000 Victorian studio portraits. The goal was twofold. First, produce a complete, fully enhanced view of the posing stand, stripping away the shadow that had concealed it for a century and a half. Second, analyze the physical characteristics of the boy's body, his posture, skin tone, apparent muscle tension, and the reflectivity of his eyes, for indicators that might help resolve the question of whether he was alive or dead when the shutter opened. The enhanced image is startling in its clarity. The cast-iron base plate emerges from the shadow unmistakably, a circular disc with a raised rim and central socket. The vertical rod extends upward behind the boy's right leg, vanishing beneath his jacket at hip height. The AI analysis yielded something more meaningful than a clearer view of the hardware. The research team identified what they termed microflexion indicators in the boy's hands. His fingers, when magnified, show a slight natural curl inconsistent with the rigid extension characteristic of post-mortem subjects. His right wrist shows a faint shadow line suggesting active muscular engagement, and at the very tips of his left-hand fingers, a subtle blur. Micro-movement during the exposure. A dead child does not move, his fingers did. The team's published conclusion was cautious but unambiguous. The photographic evidence is consistent with a living subject experiencing significant physical debilitation. The subject appears to be alive but substantially supported by the posing apparatus. Thomas was alive. His mother's letter was telling the truth. The question remains, does anyone alive today know this story? Eleanor Marston's descendants can be traced through genealogical databases and civil registration records well into the mid-20th century. Her son Arthur appears in electoral registers through the 1940s. Her daughter Jane married and raised children of her own. The family tree branches outward through the decades, each generation further removed from the November afternoon in 1878 that started everything. But no living descendant has been connected to the surviving copy of the photograph. No family member has come forward with knowledge of Thomas's death, of the studio sitting, of the metal stand hidden beneath a dying boy's feet. Mary's letter survived through the Colton line, through Jane's descendants in Harrogate, not through the Whitmore line in Leeds. The photograph entered the Thorsby Society's archive without provenance, anonymous, unnamed, one small card among thousands. It is possible, likely even, that somewhere in Leeds or beyond, people carry the genetic inheritance of Arthur and Mary Whitmore without knowing that a photograph of their ancestor exists in a box in an archive. Without knowing that a 4-year-old boy in a velvet suit once stood on Boar Lane, held upright by iron and compassion, trembling but alive, beside a sister who would remember him for 69 years. If you are that person, if Thomas or Eleanor Whitmore appears anywhere in your family tree, the Thorsby Society would like to hear from you. Look at this photograph one last time. You have spent 30 minutes with these two children. You know their names now. You know their ages. You know the name of the photographer who made this image with care and compassion on a November afternoon when the light was fading and a child was running out of time. You know the address of the house they walked from and the studio they walked to. You know what the metal stand beneath the boy's feet was designed to do. You know that his mother stood behind the camera and held her breath. You know that Thomas lived for 21 more days after this image was captured. You know that Eleanor lived for 69 more years. You know that their mother sent a copy of this photograph to her sister with the words, "So that you will have it." This is no longer a mystery. It is a family portrait. It is a farewell. It is the most important photograph the Whitmore family ever owned. Every old photograph is a locked room. The people inside cannot speak. They cannot explain why they are standing the way they are, what they were feeling, what happened in the minutes before the shutter opened or the years after it closed. They can only hold still and hope that someone someday will look closely enough to see what they were trying to say. For 140 years, Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore held still. They waited in a box in a Leeds archive, catalogued without names, filed without context, their story reduced to a single line on an index card. Two children, studio portrait, circa 1875 to 1880. They deserved better than that. Every unnamed face in every old photograph deserves better than that. Because behind every image is a life. Behind every pose is a reason. Behind every carefully composed expression is a person who once breathed and laughed and was loved. And behind every shadow, if you look carefully enough, is the truth. On November 23, 1878, a photographer in Leeds placed a metal stand beneath a child's feet, opened his shutter, and captured a single frame of light. The stand was hidden. The child was dying. The sister held still. 146 years later, the stand is no longer hidden. The child has a name. The sister has been found. And the mother, the woman who carried her son through the streets in his velvet suit and stood behind the camera holding her breath, she was right. She was right to make the journey. She was right to insist on the portrait. She was right to call it a keepsake. Because it kept him. She remembered, and now so do we. If this story meant something to you, I would ask you to do one thing. Look at the old photographs in your own family, the ones in albums, in drawers, in boxes you haven't opened in years. Look at them carefully. Look at the edges. Look at the shadows. Because every one of those images was made by someone who wanted to be remembered, and the best way to honor that wish is simply to look. If you have a family photograph with a story behind it, or a mystery you've never been able to solve, leave it in the comments. I read every one. And if the name Whitmore or Marston appears anywhere in your family tree, the Thorsby Society in Leeds would very much like to hear from you. The next video in this series examines a photograph from 1863 that contains something even the photographer didn't notice until 60 years later. I'll see you there.